maybe a little bit more related to the dispensational pre-mill view is you mentioned earlier uh, coming to a different understanding of Daniel 9. And so
Yeah.
just curious, how does that factor into your view, how you understand that chapter?
Yeah. So as I looked into this for my book, With the Clouds of Heaven, I tried to do a, it's not exhaustive, but I tried to be comprehensive. I tried
Mm-hmm.
to look at all the different ways that Daniel's 70th week is interpreted. And as far as I could tell, the only group that interprets that 70th seven literally are the pre-trib dispensationalists. They are the only people who think that Daniel's 70th week refers to a literal 7-year period that is the final 7 years of human history. Everyone else takes that 7-year period symbolically or, figuratively in some way.
Mm-hmm.
And, the question is, what does Daniel intend? And then after the question, what does Daniel intend? I think your next question is, how do other biblical authors interpret him? And so I became convinced that Daniel intends he intends the whole 70-week period to be interpreted symbolically. And I think that the symbol is seven sevens makes up a jubilee, right? So you have a 7-year period is a sabbatical cycle, and 7 sabbatical cycles make up a jubilee cycle. And so a 70-fold 7 is a 10-fold jubilee. So I think that Daniel is symbolically speaking of the consummation of the jubilee. And I don't think he means to say it's going to be exactly 490 years from now. And I would argue it wasn't exactly 490 years.
Mm-hmm.
So what the dispensationalists, I mean, one of my teachers at Dallas Theological Seminary was Harold Honer, and he's written an article where he argues that now he's got to establish his starting point, and in my opinion, that's convoluted, how he establishes his starting point. And then he's got to establish how the days are counted. But once he does all of his factoring, he argues that from the day that the decree is issued, that the city of Jerusalem can be rebuilt, until the day of the triumphal entry is exactly 483 years. Now, you know, I just don't think that works.
Sure.
I don't know how you get from um, Daniel doing the prophecy somewhere around 539 BC, um, to Ezra returning to the land in 458 BC, and then Nehemiah returning to the land in 445 BC. You subtract 33 or 30 from any of those or add it to any of those. So let's take Nehemiah's date, 445. You add 30 to that. That's 475. That's not 483. And I don't see how you get to 483, by he wants, I don't know. It's convoluted the way he makes it work. I
Sure.
don't I don't think it works. You add 30 or 33 to 459 or 458 when Ezra returned, and it's still not the right. It's still not 483 years. But so they interpret that the first 69 weeks, so where I get to 483 is 70 times 7 is 490, minus 7 is 483. So your first period is 483 years, and then your last period, if that's the way they then deal with that, is they say the church is this parenthesis. And so it's almost like you stop time between the ascension of Christ and this period right before the end, and then you start counting time again for the final 7 years.
Yeah.
And I just think that's an implausible interpretation of Daniel's 70 weeks. I think he's dealing with a tenfold jubilee, and I don't think he means to say it's going to be exactly 483 years from when I deliver this prophecy or from when the word goes out that you can restore and rebuild Jerusalem until the coming of Christ. I think he says there will be 7 weeks and for 62 weeks so that the temple is going to be rebuilt, or I forget exactly how it's worded. And then the anointed one or an anointed one will be cut off. So he's not giving you exact years. He's giving you weeks, 7 sevens and 62 sevens. And it's only by taking what I think are intended as figurative time periods and literalizing them that you get at these exact numbers. And then you're required to interpret the 70th week as a literal period of 7 years. Okay, so that's Daniel's intent. And there's more I could say about that coming out of Leviticus 26 and the way that Isaiah uses the 70-year period and the way that Jeremiah uses the 70-year period. So I would just say, I think that Isaiah 23:15 likens 70 years to the days of one king. And I think that indicates that we don't have to do a literal thing with the 70 years that Jeremiah prophesies. I think, when Isaiah says Tyre will be abandoned for 70 years like the days of one king, he means a typical human lifespan. 70 is 70 years. So I think that's what Isaiah intends. And so when Jeremiah says 70 years for Babylon, I think again, we say, okay, like the days of one king, a typical human lifespan. And then Daniel's exiled in 605. He's reading Jeremiah in 539, and the angel Gabriel comes to him. And I like and respect Andrew Steinman, who teaches, or I think he's retired now, but he did the Concordia Old Testament commentary on Daniel. He's a good guy, conservative guy, but he tries to make 605 BC to 539 BC exactly 70 years. And again, I just don't see how you do that. Looks like you're missing 4 years. And my answer to that is Isaiah didn't intend the 70 years literally. Jeremiah didn't intend the 70 years literally. Daniel sees, oh, look, 70 years have passed. The days of one king have passed. And we've got Babylon is fallen. Darius has arisen. And he starts praying and confessing sin. And the angel Gabriel comes, and Gabriel doesn't say, 4 more years, Daniel, and we'll be at 535.
Yeah.
And it'll be 70 years from 605 when you were, he gives him the revelation. And he takes the revelation of 70 years and he makes it a 7-fold revelation. And I think that flows out of Leviticus 26. Okay, so that's all Old Testament stuff. Then when we go look at what John does with this 3.5-year period in Revelation, and again, I don't think that John is interpreting Daniel's 70th week literally. So John has different ways of referring to this 3.5-year period, which Daniel 9 speaks of half of the week. And so I think what's happening is that 7-year period is being cut in half. And then John speaks of 1,260 days and 42 months and times and half a time. And each of these refers to a 3.5-year period. So let's start with 42 months. 12 months in a year, 12 times 3 is 36, plus 6 months is 42. So 42 months refers to 3.5 years. Then if you take the number 42 and you multiply it by 30, you get 1,260. So, roughly 30 days in a month times the 42 months of the 3.5-year period adds up to 1,260 days. And that, I think, also matches the time periods of about that time at the end of the book of Daniel. You've got different time periods, but they're roughly 3.5 years. And then another way that John refers to this is time, that's 1 year, times 2 years, and half a time, 3.5 years. So all this to say, I don't think that John is referring to those 3.5-year periods as, exactly adding up to a literal 7 years. I think he's interpreting that time period again symbolically in context and in conversation with other symbolic periods of time in the book of Revelation, like 1 hour in Revelation 17:12, 10 days in 2:10, and then 1,000 years in chapter 20.
Yeah.